At some point in history, someone sat at a table and decided what you could call sacred. It was not a voice descending from the heavens. It was not a divine light illuminating a scroll. It was a man, or a group of men, with enough power, enough interests, and enough political intelligence to understand that whoever controls the sacred text controls everything that comes after: power, morality, obedience, fear, and the hope of billions of people who had not yet been born. That decision was made. The documents exist. The historical traces are there, buried under centuries of carefully constructed silence. And there was a man who found those traces and had the courage to follow them to the end. In the 17th century, in a city that prided itself on being the most tolerant in Europe, a young man from a Portuguese Jewish family opened a book that no rabbi had given him permission to read. It was not a book forbidden by the Inquisition. It was something more dangerous than any prohibition. It was a book that taught how to think without asking for permission. And the thought that those pages awakened in him never left him in peace. His name was Baruch Spinoza. Later, he would choose to be called Benedictus, a name change that said everything about the transformation that had occurred within him. The Jewish boy from Amsterdam had become something that did not fit into any known religious or philosophical box. He was not a Christian. He was no longer a practicing Jew. He was not an atheist, at least not in the way his enemies tried to frame him. He was a man who had decided to think to the end, without stopping at the moment when thought begins to disturb. And this, in the 17th century, was the most subversive act any human being could commit. In 1670, Spinoza anonymously published a work that his contemporaries described as the book forged in hell, an unprecedented blasphemy, and the most dangerous text ever put on paper by human hands. The title was almost academic, too dry for the terror it caused: Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Theological Political Treatise. What lay within those pages was a philosophical bomb with a 3-century fuse. Spinoza was not questioning religion in a vague or emotional way. He was doing something much more precise and, for that reason, much more threatening. He was analyzing the Bible as a historical text. He was applying to the Word of God the same tools that any serious researcher would apply to a human document: origin, authorship, context, intention, audience, and the political and institutional interests behind each editorial choice. What he demonstrated, with a logic that is still extraordinarily difficult to refute today, destroyed entire centuries of religious certainties built on foundations that no one had dared to examine. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. The prophets did not predict the future. They responded to the urgent present of their time. The miracles were symbolic narratives constructed for specific audiences at precise historical moments. And the Bible, far from being a text transmitted directly by God to humanity, was the result of human choices accumulated over centuries: political, cultural, institutional choices, sometimes opportunistic and at many moments brutally violent. What almost no one knows is that what Spinoza published in 1670 was only the fraction he considered safe to expose at that moment. The most explosive core of his thought, the pages in which he surgically reconstructed the historical process by which the biblical canon had been assembled, the names of the groups involved, the councils that decided, the internal disputes that shaped each inclusion and each exclusion, remained in manuscript, circulating secretly among a carefully chosen circle of disciples. When Spinoza died in 1677, at just 44 years old, those manuscripts nearly disappeared completely. Some were burned, others were hidden in the basements of private libraries and monasteries. Some reached us in fragments, hastily copied by hands trembling with fear and admiration at the same time, men who knew exactly what they were doing and the price they might pay for it. What survived is enough to completely redraw the history of the most read book in the world. The story you are about to hear is built on documented historical facts, on the actual work of Spinoza, on decades of research by historians, theologians and philologists who dedicated their entire lives to reconstructing what happened behind the scenes of the formation of the most influential text that human civilization has ever produced. It is told as a narrative, because certain events, when seen in all their human dimension, deserve to be narrated with the force they carry. You will meet the men who decided what is sacred. You will understand the closed meetings, the tense councils, the internal disputes, and the calculated betrayals behind every verse you have ever heard in your life. You will comprehend why certain ideas were systematically removed from the Bible, and why those responsible for this erasure built, around this process, centuries of carefully maintained institutional silence. In the end, the sacred text will not seem smaller. It will seem larger and infinitely more complex than any sermon has ever described. Spinoza paid a brutal price for having reached where he did. He was excommunicated by his own community with words that still send chills down the spine of anyone who reads them for the first time. Cursed by day, cursed by night, cursed when lying down, cursed when rising. No specific accusation was recorded. No formal trial was conducted. No public explanation was offered. Just total silence. The maximum penalty reserved for those who know too much and have no intention of stopping. He was 23 years old, and yet he did not stop writing a single line. Amsterdam, 1642. The rain fell on the roofs of Vlooienburg as if the sky had decided to wash that part of the city with an urgency that bordered on desperation. It was the kind of rain that does not make a pretty noise, heavy, cold, insistent, beating on the stones of the narrow streets with a monotony that seeped into the bones of anyone unfortunate enough to be awake at that hour. Inside one of the houses of the Jewish community of Amsterdam, a 10-year-old child sat next to a lamp, with an open book on his lap that he definitely should not have been reading. It was not a book forbidden by the city's law. Amsterdam was, at that moment, the freest place in Europe, or at least that was how its inhabitants liked to think. Huguenots fleeing France, Protestants in conflict with the Church, Sephardic Jews expelled from Portugal and Spain, thinkers of all kinds who did not fit anywhere else on the continent, all had converged into those flooded and commercially vibrant streets of the Dutch capital, creating a unique, tense, fascinating and dangerous human mix in its own way. But within the Jewish community, the Portuguese community, as they called themselves, the Mahamad who governed the Talmud Torah synagogue, there were its own rules. Rules that did not need to be written because they were transmitted in the gaze of the elders, in the silence that fell over a table when someone mentioned the wrong name, in the tone of voice that the rabbis used when they wanted to say, without saying directly, thus far and no further. The book that Baruch Spinoza held with both hands, leaning over the lamp to take advantage of every thread of light, was a collection of philosophical commentaries on the sacred texts. Commentaries written by a man named Uriel da Costa, who had lived in Amsterdam decades earlier, who had publicly questioned the immortality of the soul, who had been excommunicated twice by the same community in which Baruch was now growing up, and who had committed suicide after a public humiliation ceremony so brutal that accounts of it still circulated in hushed tones among the elders of the neighborhood. Baruch did not yet know the whole story of Uriel da Costa. He was 10 years old. But there was something in those pages, a way of asking questions he had never seen in any other text, that held him to the chair with an intensity that neither the cold nor sleep could break. Uriel da Costa wrote like someone who had decided at some point in life that questions were more honest than ready-made answers, and that a human being who accepts an answer without examining the foundations of that answer is not a believer. He is simply a prisoner who has learned to like his own chains. Baruch read that sentence 3 times. Then he closed the book, looked at the lamp for a long moment and fell silent. The Spinoza family was not poor, but they were also not rich in the way wealth is displayed. Michael de Spinoza, Baruch's father, was a respected merchant, importing and exporting goods between Amsterdam and the Mediterranean, navigating the complicated waters of international trade in the 17th century with the accounts. But there was a distance between him and them, a chasm that widened with each passing year. He felt as if he were living in a world of shadows, where everyone else was content with the dim light, while he yearned for the brightness of understanding that eluded him. As he delved deeper into philosophy, Baruch began to question not only the texts he had studied, but also the very foundations of the beliefs that had been instilled in him since childhood. He grappled with the implications of Descartes' ideas, which urged him to scrutinize everything he had taken for granted. The more he examined the world around him, the more he realized that many of the truths he had accepted were built on shaky ground. This realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 17, Baruch found himself at a crossroads. The tension between his burgeoning intellect and the expectations of his community grew unbearable. He could no longer reconcile the teachings of his faith with the insights he was gaining from his studies. The voices of the rabbis that had once provided comfort now seemed to echo with contradictions. The sacred texts, which had been a source of guidance, now appeared to him as puzzles waiting to be solved, riddled with inconsistencies that demanded answers. He began to explore the works of other philosophers, seeking out ideas that resonated with his own. He read Spinoza, Hobbes, and Locke, each offering new perspectives that challenged the status quo. The more he read, the more he felt a sense of liberation. He was no longer bound by the constraints of dogma. He was free to think for himself. This intellectual freedom, however, came at a cost. The more he distanced himself from the beliefs of his community, the more isolated he became. Baruch's family began to notice the changes in him. His father, once proud of his son's academic achievements, grew concerned about the questions Baruch was asking. The discussions at the dinner table shifted from light-hearted banter to tense debates, with Baruch challenging the very principles that had guided their lives. His parents, steeped in tradition, struggled to understand their son's newfound skepticism. They feared for his soul, worried that he was straying too far from the path of righteousness. As the rift between Baruch and his family widened, he sought solace in the company of like-minded individuals. He began to frequent gatherings of intellectuals and free thinkers, where ideas flowed freely, and the constraints of dogma were cast aside. In these circles, he found a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer alone in his quest for truth. He was surrounded by others who shared his passion for inquiry and exploration. Yet, even in these new friendships, Baruch felt the weight of his isolation. The world outside was still filled with people who clung to their beliefs, unwilling to question the foundations of their faith. He often found himself torn between two worlds, the one he had known, steeped in tradition and certainty, and the one he was forging filled with doubt and possibility. This internal conflict became a source of anguish for him as he grappled with the implications of his evolving beliefs. By the time he turned 18, Baruch had made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He could no longer live a lie, pretending to adhere to beliefs that no longer resonated with him. He chose to leave his community behind, to step into the unknown and embrace the freedom that came with intellectual honesty. This decision was not made lightly. It was a painful severing of ties that had defined his existence for so long. As he walked away from the life he had known, Baruch felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He was stepping into a world that was both exhilarating and terrifying, a world where he could explore the depths of his thoughts without the constraints of tradition. He was determined to carve out a new identity for himself, one that was rooted in reason and inquiry rather than dogma and blind faith. In the years that followed, Baruch would become one of the most influential philosophers of his time, challenging the very foundations of religious thought and paving the way for a new era of intellectual exploration. His journey from a boy steeped in tradition to a man unafraid to question the status quo would leave an indelible mark on the world, forever changing the landscape of philosophy and faith. The contrasts with an attention that many older men could not sustain. In the synagogue, his knowledge of the texts was visible to anyone with eyes to see. But there was a layer beneath all of this, a layer that he had learned, over time and through careful observation of those who had gone too far before him, that needed to be carefully kept out of reach of others. The layer of real questions. It was around the age of 18 that Baruch began to attend a different circle. Amsterdam was a city of circles. There were the official circles, the synagogues, the churches, the trade guilds, the city councils, and there were the unofficial circles, the meetings in private homes, the conversations in specialized bookstores, the gatherings in taverns where wine served as an excuse for the kind of dialogue that could not happen anywhere with an official name and address. The circle that Baruch found was that of a man named Franciscus van den Enden. Van den Enden was a former Jesuit, an extraordinary Latinist, a frustrated doctor, an amateur playwright, and, in the assessment of practically everyone who knew him closely, one of the most radical and at the same time most joyful minds that 17th century Europe had produced. He had opened a Latin school in Amsterdam that functioned on the surface as a respectable establishment of classical education, and that operated in deeper layers as a laboratory of forbidden thought. Baruch went to study Latin. He got much more than Latin. In Van den Enden's circle he found something he had never encountered before in life, people who asked the same questions he did. Not the polished questions, the questions that teachers expected you to ask to demonstrate that you had read the material. The real questions, those that stay inside your head and do not come out, the ones that grow at night when silence has nothing else to fill it. There were doctors questioning the soul as a separate entity from the body. There were philosophers reading Hobbes in clandestine translations and debating the social contract with the seriousness of those who know that those ideas have concrete political weight. There were free thinkers. The term did not yet exist in that form, but the thing existed, who had descended by their own paths to the same kind of question that Baruch had carried since childhood. And there was, among them, something that Baruch recognized immediately and could never again pretend not to recognize: the shared conviction that religious authority, any religious authority, had a complicated and often dishonest relationship with the history of the texts upon which that authority was based. It was in those meetings that Baruch first articulated aloud, to other human beings, what had been growing inside him for years. He did not do this dramatically. He did not arrive one night at Van den Enden's circle and announce that he had discovered the Bible was a fraud. That was not Spinoza's style, neither at that moment nor at any other moment in his life. He was a man who thought in layers, who built arguments with the patience of an architect, who knows that a building needs solid foundations before anything visible. What he did was begin to ask specific questions about authorship, about chronology, about the historical processes by which certain texts had been preserved and others lost, about the hands that had copied, edited, selected, and organized the material we now call the Bible. And the answers he received from the sources he had studied, from the philologists and historians he had read, from the very medieval Jewish commentators that his formal education had taught him, but had not taught him to read closely enough, those answers formed a pattern that was not compatible with the official narrative of divine inspiration, perfect transmission, and absolute textual integrity. The pattern was different, and it was much more fascinating, much more human, and infinitely more disturbing. There is something that needs to be said here before we continue. You are hearing this story at a time when questions about the origin of the Bible circulate freely in academic books, documentaries, podcasts, and internet articles. In the 21st century, it is possible to buy in a common bookstore a historical study on the formation of the biblical canon without anyone looking at you strangely at the checkout. But try to imagine what it was like to carry those questions in the 17th century. Try to imagine the weight of knowing, or coming close to knowing, something that the entire institutional structure around you had dedicated centuries to burying. Not because the institutions were composed of especially wicked people, but because institutions, by their very nature, survive by protecting the narratives upon which they were built. And a narrative that was built on the premise that a text is directly inspired by God cannot survive an honest examination of the human origin of that text. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about how power works. And Spinoza, in that circle in Amsterdam, was arriving at this observation with a clarity that for a 20-year-old man was frightening even for him. It was also during this period that Baruch began to develop what would be, years later, one of his most revolutionary contributions to human thought, and one of the most ignored by the official narrative about what he did. We are not talking about his metaphysics. We are not yet talking about his ethics or his political theory. We are talking about something more fundamental, simpler in appearance and more explosive in consequences. We are talking about the method, Spinoza began to systematize in those formative years a way of reading the Bible that was radically different from anything that had been practiced before within the religious traditions, Jewish or Christian, a method that he would later call historical critical interpretation, and that worked as follows. To understand what a biblical text means, you do not start with theology, you start with history. Who wrote this text? At what historical moment? For what audience? What political and social problems did this audience face? What interest did the author have, or the authors, because there were often more than one? In what language was the text originally written, and what losses of meaning occurred in subsequent translations? What other texts existed at the same time and were excluded from the canon, and why were they excluded? These questions seem obvious today. In 1650, they were revolutionary in the same way that a bomb is revolutionary, not gradually but all at once. And it is here that history becomes personal in a way that goes beyond Spinoza. Because the method he was developing, this way of looking at the sacred text with the eyes of historical reason instead of the eyes of institutional faith, not only changed the way of understanding the Bible, it changed the way of understanding power. If the Bible was not a divine text transmitted in its entirety from a transcendent source, but rather a human construction accumulated over centuries, selected, edited, organized, and canonized by specific groups with specific interests, then the entire structure of authority that relied on that Bible was, in reality, relying on something much more fragile than it claimed. Kings who ruled by divine right guaranteed by the Scriptures. Popes who claimed supreme authority based on the apostolic succession documented in the Gospels. Rabbis who exercised absolute community control based on Mosaic law. All of them ultimately depended on the fact that the origin of those texts was not examined too closely, and Spinoza was about to examine, with a philosophical microscope tuned with a precision that the world had not yet seen. If you have made it this far in this story, I need to pause for a moment to speak directly to you. You did not arrive here by accident. People who stay when the story gets dense, when the narrative demands attention, when the content does not entertain but interrogates, those people are rare. You are one of them. Spinoza lived his entire life surrounded by a handful of people who could follow thought as far as he went. A small, secret, dangerous circle. The circle of those who knew too much and chose to know more nonetheless. This channel is, in a way, the same kind of circle. If what you are hearing moves you, unsettles you, makes you want to know what comes next, write in the comments now what you think Spinoza found when he finally opened the complete file. What do you believe was buried in the texts that the official tradition never wanted you to read? And if you are not yet officially part of this circle, subscribe to the channel. Because what comes next in this story is exactly the kind of thing that institutions centuries trying to keep away from you. The years between 1650 and 1656 were the years in which Spinoza built, brick by brick, the intellectual edifice that would later be called the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. But before this edifice could be constructed, there was an obstacle that was not philosophical, that was not historical, that was not intellectual in any way. It was human. It was the community that had created him, educated him, and that now, with the keen instinct that institutions develop to detect internal threats, had begun to realize that something was different about that young fabric merchant who asked too many questions and answered too few. The excommunication that would come in 1656 was not a lightning bolt falling from a clear sky. It was the result of years of surveillance, of accumulated suspicions, of reported conversations, of questions asked at the wrong times and in the wrong places. And there was behind the scenes of this process a story that almost no one knows, a story of denunciations, of economic pressures, of political alliances between the Jewish leadership and the Protestant authorities of the city, and of a document whose exact content is still debated by historians to this day. A document that may have been the most honest text Spinoza ever wrote, and that almost completely destroyed him. On the morning of July 27, 1656, Baruch Spinoza woke up as he did every day, with his head full of the same questions that had resisted the sleep of the previous night. There was a passage from the book of Joshua that he had been examining in recent weeks, a passage that contained, buried among verses of military conquest and territorial distribution, a chronological detail that did not fit at all into the narrative of Mosaic authorship. He had noted the problem in one of his notebooks, those dense notebooks, written in small, precise handwriting, that he kept with the care of someone who knows that certain thoughts need to be recorded but should not be found by the wrong kind of reader. On that July morning, while having breakfast with his brother Gabriel, the door of the house was opened by a messenger. The message was simple, direct, and by the tone with which Gabriel read it aloud, Baruch immediately understood that the moment he had, in some corners of his mind, been waiting for had finally arrived. The Mahamad, the council that governed the Jewish community of Amsterdam, required his presence. That afternoon, the Mahamad of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam was one of the most sophisticated and efficient organs of communal power that the Jewish diaspora had built. It was not just a religious council in the narrow sense of the word. It was, in practice, a parallel government, with jurisdiction over commercial contracts, family disputes, education, marriage, inheritance, and above all over what could and could not be said publicly within the community's boundaries. This power was not arbitrary. It had concrete roots in the historical situation of the Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam. The community had arrived in that city as refugees, expelled from Portugal and Spain by the Inquisition, many of them having spent generations as new Christians, practicing Judaism in secret, under the constant threat of torture and the stake. When they arrived in Amsterdam and could finally practice their faith openly, relief and freedom came accompanied by an urgent need for internal order, for cohesion, for clear boundaries between what was Jewish and what was not. Because Dutch tolerance had practical limits, and the Mahamad knew, with the accumulated wisdom of generations of the persecuted, that the survival of the community depended on not giving the non-Jews around them reasons to reconsider that tolerance. A young man who publicly questioned the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, who doubted the immortality of the soul, who frequented circles of non-Jewish free thinkers, and who seemed, with each passing year, more interested in subverting the foundations of faith than in practicing it. This young man was exactly the kind of threat that the Mahamad had developed over decades the instruments to neutralize. About what exactly happened in the weeks leading up to Spinoza's excommunication, historians have debated for generations. Official documents are scarce. The Mahamad's records for that period are laconic in a way that does not seem accidental, as if the people who produced them knew they were dealing with a case that was better not overly documented. But there are fragments, there are letters, there are references in later correspondence, and there is, above all, the text of the Cherem itself, the Excommunication, which has survived intact and which, when read carefully, reveals more than it seems at first glance. The text of Spinoza's Excommunication is, for anyone who has read other similar documents from the period, immediately surprising for one thing. It says nothing. It does not say anything specific, if you understand. It accuses Spinoza of abominable heresies and monstrous works, but it does not enumerate these heresies. It does not describe these works. In contrast to other excommunication processes of the time, which typically listed precisely the beliefs or behaviors that motivated the punishment, the document against Spinoza is deliberately vague about the details. Why? The most likely answer, according to historians who have examined the issue more closely, is that the Mahamad had a specific problem. Spinoza's ideas were too dangerous to be repeated, even in a document of condemnation. Putting them on paper, even to denounce them, was to give them a permanent form. It was to enable someone someday to read that document and say, "But look, what he said makes sense." Silence. In this case was a form of protection. But there was a second reason, equally important, that most narratives about Spinoza do not mention with the emphasis it deserves. There was a document that Spinoza had written, or that had circulated in his name, with or without his direct knowledge, and that had reached the hands of the Mahamad at a particularly delicate moment in the relations between the Jewish community and the Protestant authorities of Amsterdam. The exact nature of this document is one of the most fascinating enigmas of the intellectual history of the 17th century. Some historians believe it was a preliminary version of what would later become the Tractatus, a draft of the analyses on biblical authorship that Spinoza was developing at that time. If that is the case, then the Muhammad had access, before any formal publication, to the explosive core of Spinoza's thought on the human origins of the Bible. Other historians, and this is the theory that has gained more evidence in the last 50 years of research, believe that the document was something different, something more direct, a kind of apology, a text in which Spinoza responded to the accusations that had begun to circulate against him within the community, defending his positions with a clarity and boldness that, in the political circumstances of that moment, amounted to signing a death warrant against himself. This second document, if it existed in the form that some scholars suggest, contained something that no religious leader of the time was prepared to hear said aloud, and with solid philosophical argumentation. It contained the assertion that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, not as an insinuation, not as a discreet wink in the style of Ibn Ezra, as an argument, grounded in specific textual evidence, with citations, with chronological analysis, with the identification of at least 7 passages that logically could not have been written by the same author as the surrounding parts of the text, and that pointed instead to a long, editorial process of composition done by multiple hands over centuries. To understand why this was devastating beyond the Jewish context, one must understand what the Pentateuch represented not only for Judaism, but for the entire structure of Western monotheism. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible from the creation of the world to the death of Moses, was the foundation, not just in an abstract theological sense, in a practical, legal, political, and social sense. The Torah was the document that justified the election of the Jewish people. It was the source of the law that governed every aspect of communal life. It was the reason why the Muhammad had the authority it had. But also, and here is the dimension that crossed religious boundaries, it was the basis upon which Christians built the narrative of the Old Testament as preparation for the New. It was the document that both Jews and Christians used, with different arguments, to justify their claims to exclusive truth. If Moses did not write the Pentateuch, then the narrative of direct divine revelation, God speaking to Moses on Sinai, delivering the law in a vertical and uncontaminated transmission from the divine to the human, was compromised at its foundation. And if that narrative was compromised, then the entire structure of religious authority built upon it was also at risk. Style, vocabulary, and theological emphasis, and concluded that they were written by different authors at different times. This was a radical departure from the traditional view, which insisted on a singular authorship. Spinoza's analysis revealed that the biblical text was not a monolithic entity, but rather a compilation of diverse voices and perspectives, each reflecting the historical and cultural contexts in which they were produced. Furthermore, Spinoza pointed out the inconsistencies in the narrative flow and the theological implications of these contradictions. For instance, the portrayal of God in the 2 creation accounts differed significantly. One depicted a more transcendent deity, while the other presented a more anthropomorphic figure. This divergence suggested that the texts were not merely different interpretations of the same divine will, but rather distinct theological positions that had emerged over time. Spinoza's approach was not merely to critique the text, but to understand it within its historical framework. He emphasized the importance of context, arguing that to grasp the true meaning of the biblical texts, one must consider the socio-political circumstances of the time they were written. This meant acknowledging the influence of historical events, cultural practices, and the evolving nature of language itself. In Rheinsberg, Spinoza also began to explore the implications of his findings for the nature of religious authority. If the Bible was not the direct word of God, but rather a collection of human writings shaped by historical circumstances, then the foundations of religious authority were called into question. This realization was both liberating and perilous. It opened the door to a more rational understanding of faith, but also placed Spinoza at odds with the very institutions that had once provided him with a sense of belonging. As he delved deeper into his studies, Spinoza became increasingly aware of the potential consequences of his work. The more he uncovered about the nature of the biblical texts, the more he recognized the challenge it posed to established religious beliefs. He was not merely challenging the interpretation of Scripture, he was questioning the very basis of religious dogma itself. Spinoza's writings from this period reflect a profound sense of intellectual freedom, but they also reveal the weight of the isolation he felt. He was navigating a path that few had dared to tread, and the stakes were high. The excommunication had severed his ties to the Jewish community, and now he found himself in a position where he could not return to the familiar comforts of faith. Instead, he was forging a new identity as a philosopher, one that would ultimately redefine the relationship between reason and religion. In the years that followed, Spinoza's work would continue to evolve, culminating in his magnum opus, the Ethics. This work would encapsulate his philosophical vision, integrating his insights on the nature of God, the universe, and human existence into a coherent system of thought. It would challenge not only the religious orthodoxy of his time, but also lay the groundwork for modern philosophy. Spinoza's legacy is one of courage in the face of adversity, a testament to the power of intellectual inquiry and the pursuit of truth. His willingness to confront the established norms of his day, to question the very foundations of belief, has left an indelible mark on the landscape of Western thought. In a world where conformity often reigns, Spinoza stands as a beacon of the transformative potential of critical thinking and the relentless quest for understanding. Vocabulary, narrative structure, references to the divine, one uses Elohim, the other uses Yahweh, and came to a conclusion that the philologists of the 20th century would confirm as one of the fundamental discoveries of modern biblical criticism. The two accounts are not two chapters of the same work. They are fragments of two independent works, written in different periods by different authors that were united by an editorial hand at some point after both. This meant that Genesis was not a single text. It was a compilation. And if it was a compilation, there was a compiler, someone who had taken pre-existing texts and organized them in a sequence, someone who had made choices, what to include, what to exclude, in what order to present the narratives, where to soften contradictions, and where to leave them visible. Someone, in other words, who had edited the Word of God. The identification of this editorial hand was Spinoza's second great methodological advance, and it is where the argument begins to connect with the larger question that forms the heart of this story. Because an editor is not just a technician. An editor is someone with a project, with a vision, with interests, with a narrative they want to build or preserve. And when Spinoza began to outline the contours of the editorial hand that had assembled the Pentateuch, analyzing not only the contradictions and anachronisms, but the patterns of selection, thematic emphases, significant omissions, the points where the narrative seemed to have been softened or reoriented, a profile began to emerge, a profile that pointed to a specific historical period, to a specific political context, to a group with specific interests in the content of these texts. The period was the post-Babylonian exile, the centuries in which the Jewish people returned from Babylon to the land of Israel in a process of national and religious reconstruction that required, above all, a founding document that could unify dispersed communities and establish a solid collective identity. The group was the Levitical priesthood, the Kohanim, the temple priests, who had control of religious worship as the source of their political and economic power. And the project was exactly what it seems, the construction of a sacred text that legitimized both national identity and the structure of priestly authority, presenting both not as historical choices, but as immutable divine ordinations. This analysis, which Spinoza developed over the years in Rheinsberg, with a wealth of detail and foundation that we can only sketch here, was not simply a theory about the authorship of the Pentateuch. It was a theory about how power works. It was the demonstration that the text that had been presented for centuries as the direct word of God was, in reality, the product of a specific historical process, a process that involved political choices, power disputes, and the deliberate construction of a narrative that served the interests of those who built it, not conspiratorially, not as an evil plan executed by men dishonestly aware that they were deceiving posterity. History rarely works that way. The process had been more gradual, more organic, more complex than any deliberate conspiracy could be. But the consequences were the same. The text we now call the Bible was the result of human decisions. Decisions about what to include and what to exclude, about which narratives to preserve and which to let die, about which image of God should emerge from those pages and which should be suppressed. And these decisions had not been made in a single moment. They had been made over centuries, in multiple stages, by multiple groups with multiple interests, which meant that there was not one editor, but a chain of editors, a chain that Spinoza, now 30 years old and with the manuscript of the Tractatus taking shape in his hands, was preparing to name, to understand who the editors of the Bible were, who really sat at the table and said this text stays, that one does not. It is necessary to go back to a moment that history books mention briefly, but rarely examine with the attention it deserves. It is necessary to go to Babylon, not to the mythical Babylon of the hanging gardens and towers that touch the sky, to the historical Babylon of the 6th century before the Common Era, the Babylon of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who in 587 BCE destroyed Jerusalem, burned the Temple of Solomon, and took the elite of the Jewish people into exile in one of the most documented mass deportations of ancient history. What happened during the 50 years of the Babylonian exile, and in the centuries that followed the return, is the key to understanding what Spinoza found when he looked at the texts with eyes methodically free of institutional reverence. Imagine for a moment what it means to lose the temple. For ancient Judaism, the Temple of Jerusalem was not just a religious building in the sense we understand today. The kind of place people go to on Sundays or Saturdays and leave with the week organized around a moral orientation. The temple was the center of the universe. Literally, in the Jewish cosmology of the time, it was the point where the world of humans and the world of the divine met, where sacrifices sustained cosmic order, where the presence of God dwelled in a sancta sanctorum to which only the high priest had access, and only once a year. Destroying the temple was not just a military act. It was a cosmological statement. The God of this people was defeated by the God of the conqueror. That was the interpretation neighboring peoples made of the destruction. And it was an interpretation that the Jewish people in exile urgently needed to refute. Not only for the external world, but for themselves. To not lose cohesion, to not dissolve over generations into the dominant cultures of Babylon and later Persia. And it was to respond to this existential urgency that the scribes and priests of the exile began to work. The work they carried out over the decades of exile, and that continued with varying rhythms and intensities for the following centuries, was one of the most ambitious editorial projects any civilization of antiquity ever undertook. They collected, organized, edited, compiled. There were texts that circulated in different versions among the different tribes and groups of the Jewish people, narratives of creation, genealogical lists, stories of the patriarchs, records of laws and rituals, collections of psalms and songs, historical archives of the monarchies of Israel and Judah. Some of these texts were very old, dating back to oral traditions before the monarchy. Others were more recent, produced in specific contexts for specific purposes. The scribes of the exile took this heterogeneous, contradictory, overlapping material and built with it a coherent narrative, or something that seemed coherent. Spinoza, working in Rheinsberg with the texts before him and the instruments of the historical critical method developed over the years, clearly identified the result of this editorial process. There were in the Pentateuch at least 4 distinct textual sources that could be identified by consistent stylistic, theological, and narrative criteria. The first used the name Elohim to refer to God, presented a transcendent and majestic view of the divinity, and focused on issues of cosmic and universal order. It was probably the oldest of the sources, perhaps originating in the northern kingdom of Israel before its destruction in 722 BCE. The second used the name Yahweh, presented a more intimate and personal God, often anthropomorphic, and focused on personal relationships between God and the patriarchs. It probably originated in the southern kingdom, Judah. The third, which modern scholars would call Deuteronomist, was characterized by a specific rhetorical style, by a theology centered on obedience to the law and the consequences of deviation, and by a view of Israel's history as a series of cycles of fidelity and infidelity to God. This source was clearly connected to the religious reform movement associated with King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, the same reform that had mysteriously discovered the Book of the Law in the Temple and had centralized worship exclusively in Jerusalem. The fourth, with the priestly source, was the most systematic and most clearly connected to the interests of the Levitical priesthood. It focused on genealogies, rituals, laws of purity, religious calendars, and the legitimization of the priestly structure as a necessary intermediary between the people and God. And there was a fifth hand, the final editor, whom Spinoza would call the compiler, who had united these sources into a single narrative, making choices about how to harmonize them where they contradicted each other, and about which tensions should be left visible. What made Spinoza's analysis different from a simple academic observation was the question he asked next, the question that purely textual scholars rarely asked, because it led them into uncomfortably political territory. Whom did each of these sources serve? The priestly source, for example, was elaborated in extraordinary detail on the prerogatives and privileges of the priesthood. It dedicated entire chapters to the rules of sacrifice, the types of offerings that were to be made to the temple, the part that belonged to the priests in each ceremony, and the conditions under which only the priests could approach the divine. It was, essentially, a manual of institutional power disguised as religious law. Whoever had written this source had a direct interest in legitimizing the priesthood as an indispensable intermediary institution. The Deuteronomist source, with its narrative of historical cycles and its focus on obedience centralized in Jerusalem, served the interests of a specific class of scribes and judges who had gained influence with the reform of Josiah, a reform that had destroyed local shrines and concentrated all religious power in the capital. Each layer of the text had an author, and each author had an address. But there was something even more disturbing than identifying the sources. It was identifying what had been excluded. Because the history of the formation of the biblical canon is not just the history of what entered. It is, equally, the history of what was left out. Spinoza knew, and any scholar of ancient Jewish literature knew, that there was a considerable amount of religious texts from the biblical period that had not entered the official canon. Some of these texts were known through references in other texts. Others survived in fragments found in ancient libraries. Still others were mentioned by name in the canonical books themselves. There are explicit references in the Old Testament to works such as the Book of the Wars of Yahweh and the Book of the Just, neither of which exists in the canon. Where were these books? Who had decided that they were not sacred? Based on what criteria? The answer, which Spinoza began to articulate with increasing precision in his Rheinsberg manuscripts, pointed to a specific historical process. A process that was not mystical, not spiritual, and that had everything to do with political power and institutional cohesion. The process had occurred in two major moments. The first, in the centuries following the Babylonian exile, when the returning scribes and priests with Ezra and Nehemiah established the Torah, the 5 books, as the founding document of the reconstituted community. This process had excluded a significant amount of material that conflicted with the theological and institutional vision that the leaders of the return wanted to promote. The second moment was, for Spinoza, even more revealing and even less discussed by the official tradition. It was the Council of Yavne. Yavne was a coastal city in present-day Israel, and it was there, in the years following the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, another catastrophic destruction, another moment of existential crisis for the Jewish people, that a group of rabbis gathered to make decisions that would shape Judaism for the next 2,000 years. Among these decisions was the most important that any religious body ever made about the Hebrew Bible, the decision about which books were in the canon and which were out. The process was not, as later tradition would present it, the simple confirmation of choices that were already obvious. It was a deliberation with disputes, with arguments, with books that almost did not enter and books that almost did not leave. The Song of Songs, a remarkably explicit erotic poem that is part of the Hebrew Bible, was nearly excluded, and only remained thanks to Rabbi Akiva's argument that it was an allegory of God's love for Israel. The book of Ecclesiastes, with its philosophical skepticism bordering on nihilism, almost did not enter for opposite reasons. And there were other texts, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the texts from the Qumran community that would be found in the 20th century in the caves of the Dead Sea, that were completely left out, not because they were less ancient or less revered by the communities that used them, but because they conflicted in specific ways with the theological vision that the rabbis of Yavne were constructing for post-temple Judaism. This is what Spinoza found when he applied the historical critical method to the question of canon formation. Not a divine revelation descending from heaven in complete and perfect form, but a human process, long contested, political, full of contingent choices that could have been different, and that were made by people with names, with interests, with institutional positions at precise historical moments. And what made this discovery so potentially devastating for the structures of religious power in the 17th century was not just what it said about the past, it was what it said about the present. If religious authority, rabbinic, papal, Protestant, was founded on the divine authenticity of a text that was demonstrably a human construction, then that authority was based on something that it could not honestly examine without destroying itself. It was like a foundation of sand that had, over the centuries, convinced itself that it was rock, and Spinoza was pointing his finger at the sand. The Hague, 1665. Spinoza was 33 years old and had moved again, from Rheinsberg to Voorburg, and now to the larger, more cosmopolitan, and politically charged city of The Hague, where the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus was reaching its final form after nearly a decade of elaboration. He polished lenses during the day. He received correspondence from philosophers and scientists across Europe. Leibniz would try to visit him. Oldenburg wrote regularly from the Royal Society in London. Huygens consulted him on optical issues. To the outside world, he was a philosophically interesting lens polisher, a kind of eccentric sage who lived modestly and thought deeply. For the few who knew what was being written in that simple room in The Hague, he was something entirely different. He was the man who was about to put into print for the first time in history a systematic and rigorous argument about the human origin of biblical texts and about the political consequences of recognizing that origin. The decision-making process about publishing the Tractatus was in itself a philosophical story. Spinoza knew what he was doing. He knew exactly the level of hostility that the text would generate. He had seen what had happened to thinkers less radical than he. He had seen what had happened on the other side of Europe to Galileo. He had seen what had happened much closer to Uriel da Costa, the man whose book had opened his mind as a child and whose life had ended in a public humiliation ceremony. But there was also something he saw clearly that others could not see with the same clarity. The historical moment was changing. The 30 Years' War had ended in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, and one of the practical consequences of that treaty was the formal recognition that Europe could not continue to destroy itself in religious wars. The principle of religious tolerance, still fragile, still full of exceptions but real, had been inscribed in an international document for the first time. The Netherlands, in particular, had emerged from this period as the dominant commercial power in Europe, and its success was directly linked to its relative intellectual and religious openness. The Dutch Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense, and it was not a paradise of tolerance without friction, but it was, at that moment, the place in the world where an explosive book had the greatest chance of being published without its author being immediately imprisoned or killed. Spinoza calculated, and decided that the moment had come. But there was a decision to be made before publication, a decision that says a lot about how Spinoza understood the relationship between truth and power. The Tractatus would be published anonymously, not out of cowardice. Spinoza was not a man of intellectual cowardice. This was demonstrated by how he had refused the agreement offered by the Muhammad 14 years earlier, and by how he continued to develop and share his most explosive ideas at a time when it remained dangerous. The decision for anonymity was strategic. It was the understanding that a nameless book has a different kind of power than a signed book. A signed book can be attacked through its author, disqualified by association, destroyed through ad hominem accusations, buried under the weight of the negative reputation that the author's enemies can build around their name. A nameless book has to be confronted directly in its arguments on the ground where Spinoza felt absolutely comfortable. Furthermore, there was a distribution detail that was fundamental to Spinoza's project. The Tractatus was published in Latin, not in Dutch, not in a language that the general public could easily read. It was explicitly directed at the educated audience, philosophers, theologians, and literate people who were in a position to understand and convey his ideas. This was not elitism. It was another form of calculation. Spinoza understood that the most dangerous ideas need time to find the right ground. A book that is immediately understandable to everyone is also immediately attackable by everyone. A book that requires study, that demands the reader to linger, that allows itself to be worked on by the ideas before being judged. That book has a different chance of survival. When the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus appeared in the bookstores of Amsterdam in 1670, published under the false name of a fictitious editor from Hamburg, the reaction was exactly what Spinoza had predicted, and perhaps a bit more intense than he had even estimated. Within 3 months, the book had been condemned by the Dutch Reformed Church. Within 6 months, it had been declared heretical by ecclesiastical authorities in multiple countries. Within a year, it was on the list of banned books in several European states, and it was being read, in the copies that circulated clandestinely, by practically every serious intellectual in Europe who managed to get their hands on a copy. The letters from Leibniz, from Oldenburg, from other correspondents of Spinoza during that period show the speed with which the text spread and the intensity with which it provoked reactions. Reactions of horror, of fascination, of carefully disguised recognition, of public attacks often made by people who privately admitted that the book had irreversibly disturbed their way of thinking. What the Tractatus argued in terms that any educated reader of the time could follow can be summarized in 5 central theses, although the word summarize does injustice to the complexity and richness of the original argument. The first thesis was the one that most directly attacked the foundation of religious authority. The prophets did not possess philosophical knowledge superior to that of ordinary people. They had powerful imagination and a capacity to express moral ideas in a vivid and emotionally impactful way, but their visions and revelations were the product of human minds intensely committed to their time and culture, not direct windows to transcendent truth. The second thesis was about authorship. The Pentateuch was not written by Moses, and the other historical books were not written by the prophets to whom they are attributed. They were compilations produced by later editors, and the clues to identify these editors and their periods were in the text itself. The third thesis, and here was the most directly political dimension, was that Mosaic law had been a civil law specific to the ancient state of Israel, not an eternal and universal law applicable to all peoples at all times. The Levitical priesthood had constructed the narrative of universal law to perpetuate its own power. But this was precisely the type of human decision, political, institutional, that Spinoza had identified as the central mechanism by which the sacred had been constructed. The fourth thesis was about the relationship between faith and reason. Religion had its legitimate domain in practical morality and social cohesion, but it had no authority over questions of philosophical and scientific knowledge. The sphere of the state and the sphere of the church were distinct, and confusing the two produced precisely the type of tyranny, religious or political, that had bloodied European history. The fifth thesis was, in a way, the most radical of all, and it was the one that most 17th-century commentators preferred not to examine directly. God and nature were the same thing. What we call God is not a personal entity that intervenes in history, that chooses peoples, that delivers laws, that performs miracles on request. It is the infinite substance of the universe, which operates according to necessary and immutable laws. The idea of a personal God who communicates with human beings through written texts was a human projection, powerful, culturally significant, but a projection. These 5 theses together formed the most complete argument that had been published up to that point against the authority of the sacred text as the foundation of political and institutional power. But there was something in the Tractatus that was even more important than the theses, and that is rarely mentioned in discussions about the impact of the book. It was the method. Spinoza was not just arriving at different conclusions from the official conclusions. He was teaching the reader how to arrive at different conclusions. He was demonstrating, step by step, with specific examples and concrete textual analyses, how to read the Bible in a way that sees what is there instead of what tradition said was there. This was much more dangerous than any specific heresy, because a specific heresy can be answered with a specific orthodoxy. An argument can be counter-argued, but a method, when it is genuinely rigorous and genuinely teachable, changes the way people think permanently and irreversibly. Spinoza's method, which in the 19th century would be formalized in the academic discipline known as higher criticism or historical criticism of the Bible, would forever transform the way serious theologians, historians, and philologists approach sacred texts. But in 1670 he was just coming into the world, and the world was not prepared to receive him. The response of religious authorities to the Tractatus was immediate, coordinated, and in many respects revealing. The predominant strategy was not intellectual refutation. It was not sitting down with the text, examining the arguments point by point, and showing where Spinoza's reasoning failed. Some intellectuals tried to do this, and most of them found, to their discomfort, that refuting Spinoza on his own ground was much more difficult than any previous religious controversy had prepared any of them to face. The predominant strategy was another: suppress the name, destroy the reputation, and ensure that the text circulated with labels that functioned as warnings. Written by the atheist, the Book of Hell, a trap of Satan for those who do not have sufficiently solid faith to resist the seduction of reason. These labels worked. For most people who would never read the book, who would never have access to it even if they wanted to, the name Spinoza became synonymous with danger, moral dissolution, everything that needed to be resisted to preserve faith and social order. But for those who read the book with a mind open enough to follow the argument to the end, the effect was the opposite. It was the irreversible feeling that a window had been opened that could never be closed again. There is a library in Oxford, the Bodleian, where in one of its repositories less accessible to the general public, there exists a collection of 17th century manuscripts that has gone generations without receiving the attention it deserved. Not because it was unknown to specialists, but because the material it contained was the kind that creates institutional discomfort, the kind of discomfort that is resolved not by destroying the material, which would be scandalous, but simply by not promoting it. Among these manuscripts are copies of texts that circulated in the period immediately after the publication of Spinoza's Tractatus. Texts that carried forward the analysis he had initiated, texts that he himself had inspired, and texts that were attributed to him by contemporaries with direct access to his circle, but that were never included in the official edition of his works. What these texts contain is the most explosive core of the Spinozist project regarding the formation of the biblical canon, the part that he considered prudent not to publish in 1670, but that he could not completely contain within the limits of the private circle to which it had been intended. To understand why these texts were considered more dangerous than the Tractatus itself, one must understand what the Tractatus had left out. The Tractatus had demonstrated that the Bible was a text composed by multiple authors over multiple periods. It had identified the different textual layers, had analyzed the internal contradictions, had placed the question of Mosaic authorship on rigorous argumentative ground instead of religious doctrine. But there was one question that the Tractatus had raised without fully answering: which texts had been excluded from the canon, and why? This question was the most directly threatening to the structures of religious power, both Jewish and Christian, because it touched on the issue that no authority wanted to examine: the arbitrariness of the sacred. If texts that we now call sacred were included in the canon for political and institutional reasons, then it is logically necessary to admit that texts that are outside the canon may be equally valid, equally ancient, equally connected to the religious traditions that produced them. They simply had the misfortune of being produced by groups that were on the wrong side of power disputes when the canonical decisions were made. Spinoza had access to information about non-canonical texts that was unusual even by the standards of his extraordinary erudition. Part of this information came from the medieval commentators he had studied. Since youth, medieval rabbis mentioned, with a consistency that had intrigued Spinoza since adolescence, the existence of oral and written traditions that had not entered the canon but continued to circulate in the more advanced study circles. Part of this came from his access, through the intellectual network he had built in the years since his excommunication, to the discussions that took place among Christian scholars about the Apocrypha, those texts that Catholic Bibles included, but Protestant Bibles had excluded, and about whose validity theologians continued to dispute with an intensity that revealed to Spinoza exactly how recent and contingent the decision to exclude them had been. And part came from something that few biographers of Spinoza mention with the emphasis it deserves: his access, through the network of contacts that his family had maintained even after the excommunication, to materials that circulated in the Portuguese converso community, the descendants of Jews who had been forcibly converted to Christianity in Portugal and Spain, and who had preserved, sometimes for generations, and in sometimes syncretic and surprising ways, fragments of traditions that the official orthodoxy of both religions had tried to suppress. What emerged from this set of sources, when Spinoza began to systematically map what had been excluded from the canon and the identifiable reasons for those exclusions, was a portrait of the canonical process radically different from the official narrative of progressive revelation and orderly organization of sacred texts. It was the portrait of a selection process that had been, at multiple moments, violently contested. There was, for example, the question of the books that the Old Testament mentions by name but that do not exist in the canon. The Book of the Wars of Yahweh, cited in Numbers. The Book of the Just, cited in Joshua and in Samuel. The Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, repeatedly cited in the books of Kings as sources of the information contained therein. These books clearly existed. They were considered sufficiently authoritative to be cited in the texts that entered the canon. And yet, they did not survive, or more precisely, were not preserved, while the texts that cited them were preserved. Why? The answer that traditional scholars offered was the simplest possible: these texts simply got lost. Nothing conspiratorial, nothing intentional, just the chance of history, the fragility of ancient writing materials, the fires and wars and floods that destroyed libraries. Spinoza examined this answer with the same attention he devoted to everything, and he reached a different conclusion. The pattern of survival of ancient texts was not random. It was selective in a way that systematically correlated with the interests of the institutions that had controlled the preservation of texts in different historical periods. The texts that survived were, consistently, the texts that confirmed the authority of the institutions that preserved them. The texts that conflicted with that authority, that presented alternative versions of history, that showed figures of authority in an unfavorable light, that legitimized forms of religious practice different from those promoted by the official scribes, tended to disappear. This did not require a centralized conspiracy. It did not need any secret council convened to deliberate on which texts to destroy. The mechanism was much simpler and much more efficient. The texts that served power were copied repeatedly, carefully stored, transferred from library to library with the due attention given to precious objects. The texts that did not serve power simply did not receive the same treatment. They were left in deteriorating scrolls, not recopied when the physical support began to disintegrate, ignored in the transfers of collections. The result, over centuries, was a canonical library that was not a representative sample of the religious texts of the period. It was a curation, a selection made based on criteria that had more to do with institutional power than with antiquity, authenticity, or spiritual importance. For the project of the Tractatus and the manuscripts that complemented it, Spinoza identified 3 specific historical moments when the selection process had been especially intense, and especially revealing of its mechanisms. The first moment was the period of Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE, when the leaders of the return from the Babylonian exile established the Torah as the founding text of the reconstituted community. This period involved not only the organization of existing texts, but what Spinoza called reformulation, the process by which historical narratives had been rewritten from the theological perspective that the leaders of the return wanted to promote. The Book of Chronicles, which resumes the history of the kings with a deliberately different perspective, was the clearest example of this reformulation process. Not a crude falsification, but a selective rewriting that emphasized what served the new narrative and omitted what did not. The second moment was the Council of Yavne in the years following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which Spinoza had studied in sufficient detail to be able to reconstruct not only the decisions made, but the arguments that had circulated in the process. The debates about the Song of Songs, about Ecclesiastes, about the various texts that almost entered, but did not enter. These debates were windows into the logic that governed the decisions. And this logic was clearly more theological political than spiritual, in the sense that the guardians of the canon wanted to be believed. The third moment was what Spinoza approached with more caution in his manuscripts, not because he had less certainty about it, but because it was the most politically explosive for the European context of the 17th century. It was the formation of the Christian canon. The process by which Christian churches had established the 27 books of the New Testament as sacred text was, in many respects, even more clearly political than the process that had formed the Hebrew canon. Because there was documentation, the debates were more recent, the minutes of some councils had survived, and there were, surviving on the margins of the Orthodox tradition, texts that had been considered sacred by primitive Christian communities, and that the canonical process had excluded, the Gospels we now call apocryphal, the letters attributed to apostles that did not enter the New Testament, the Gnostic texts that presented a version of the story of Jesus and his teaching radically different from the one the official church had chosen to preserve. Spinoza knew of the existence of many of these texts. Some he accessed through the discussions of Renaissance humanist scholars, who had begun to question the authorship of certain letters of the New Testament. Others reached him through indirect means, references in polemical authors, mentions in private letters from correspondents who had access to collections that did not circulate publicly. What these texts showed, when mapped in relation to the canonical decisions, was a pattern that mirrored in a disturbingly consistent way the pattern that Spinoza had identified in the Hebrew canon. The texts that entered the Christian canon were consistently the texts that legitimized the hierarchical structure of the Church that had emerged victorious from the theological wars of the early centuries. The texts that were left out were, equally consistently, the texts that presented the Christian teaching in a more horizontal, more egalitarian way, more resistant to the institutionalization of priestly and episcopal power. The Gospel of Thomas, which presented Jesus as a wisdom teacher, without sacramental structure, without ecclesiastical hierarchy, with a teaching centered on individual self-knowledge, had been left out. The Synoptic Gospels, with their narrative of the foundation of the Church on Peter and their structure of delegated apostolic authority, had entered. Coincidence? Spinoza did not use that word without irony. The conclusion that emerged from all this mapping, the conclusion that Spinoza developed in the manuscripts that circulated secretly among his closest circle of disciples, was of a simplicity that made its strength even more difficult to contest. The biblical canon was not a revelation. It was an editorial policy, a policy that had been executed in multiple stages, by multiple groups, with interests that were recognizably human at each stage of the process, a policy that had decided based on criteria that had more to do with institutional power than with any other factor, which words would have the right to be called sacred and which would be condemned to silence. And the religious structure that had emerged from this process, the structure that still governed the lives of hundreds of millions of people in 17th century Europe, that still determined who could govern and who could not, what could be thought and what could not, what constituted morality and what constituted crime. This structure rested on a foundation that, when examined with historical honesty, revealed its cracks with a clarity that made it difficult to understand how it had lasted so long. The answer, as Spinoza knew, was simple. It had lasted so long because no one with the tools necessary intellectuals to see the cracks had also had the combination of courage and freedom necessary to say what they saw. Until now. In the winter of 1676, Spinoza was ill. Not dramatically. There was no clear diagnosis, no sudden crisis marking a turning point. It was the kind of illness that comes slowly, that settles in the lungs with the patience of something that knows it has time on its side. Tuberculosis, as it would be identified retrospectively by biographers, had begun to take up space in that body that had spent years in a lens-polishing workshop, breathing the fine glass dust that, paradoxically, had been the sustenance that freed him to think. He was 43 years old, and there was unfinished work. What Spinoza left behind when he died in February 1677, with 44 years on a Sunday, while his landlord and some friends were at Mass, was an intellectual legacy of a density and scope that his contemporaries could not yet fully measure. The Ethics, his most ambitious philosophical work, was complete but unpublished. The friends who formed his closest circle, Jarig Jelles, Peter van Gent, Georg Hermann Schuler, and others, had received specific instructions on what should be published and what should be destroyed. The letters he had exchanged with correspondents from all over Europe were organized so they could be published as a complement to the main works. And there were, in addition to all this, the manuscripts that contained the most explosive core of his research on the formation of the biblical canon, the detailed analyses of the excluded texts, the reconstructions of the editorial process at each of the critical historical moments he had identified, and the political implications that logically unfolded from those analyses. These manuscripts were the problem. Spinoza's friends were courageous men in the context of their time. They were men who had chosen to associate with the most controversial thinker in Europe, who had maintained that association even when social and religious pressures made that choice risky, who had promised the dying man that they would preserve and publish his work. But there were limits to what was prudent to publish in 1677. The Ethics was already explosive enough, and yet it was published under his full name a few months after Spinoza's death by the friends who fulfilled the promise made. The publication generated immediate condemnations from all sides. The Dutch authorities banned the book within months. The press across Europe produced an avalanche of refutations, attacks, and solemn warnings about the dangers of Spinozist atheism. The manuscripts on the canon were, in comparison, like carrying the already published Ethics and multiplying its incendiary potential by a factor of 3. Because the Ethics attacked the concept of a personal God and the narrative of creation in an abstract, philosophical, metaphysical way, it was possible to attack it on the ground of metaphysics. It was possible to say, this is a philosophical error, here is where the argument fails. The manuscripts on the canon were not abstract, they were historical, they were specific. They contained names, dates, concrete textual analyses, identification of specific passages, reconstruction of documented historical processes. They were the kind of thing that, if published in all their extent and detail, would turn the controversy over the formation of the canon into no longer an abstract philosophical question, but an empirical historical case, the kind that, once opened, cannot be closed again with theological arguments. The decision that Spinoza's friends made about what to do with these manuscripts was pragmatic, painful and completely understandable given the context. They published what they could, they archived what was risky, and they left, buried in the private collections that were being dispersed over the following decades, a set of material that would only be recognized in its full extent by scholars in the 20th century, but not before having traced, in its passages through different hands over the centuries, a trail of influence that is one of the most fascinating and least told stories in Western intellectual history. The 18th century was the century that harvested, often without admitting the source, what Spinoza had sown. The Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, Diderot, D'Holbach, Bayle, drank from the Tractatus with a consistency that their writings make evident to anyone who compares the sources attentively. The Enlightenment critique of institutional religion, the emphasis on reason as the arbiter of truth over religious authority, the desacralization of ecclesiastical history, all of this built, often without explicit citation, and sometimes with explicit denials of influence, on the foundations that Spinoza had laid. Voltaire, who publicly called Spinoza a systematic atheist, in terms that were not exactly flattering, privately used arguments taken directly from the Tractatus in his critiques of the Bible. The hypocrisy was not personal, it was strategic. Citing Spinoza in 1750 was still making oneself a target. Using his arguments without citing him was safer. The 19th century was the century in which Spinoza's project on the historical analysis of the Bible finally emerged from the intellectual underground into academia. The German scholars who developed what would become known as Bibelkritik, the historical criticism of the Bible, were doing, with the instruments of philology and historiography of the 19th century, what Spinoza had outlined with the more rudimentary tools of the 17th century. Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, Wilhelm de Wette, Julius Wellhausen, the great names of biblical historical criticism in the 19th century, systematically developed the theory of multiple sources of the Pentateuch that Spinoza had identified 200 years earlier. Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, which identified the four main sources of the Pentateuch and designated them as J, E, D, and P, which correspond remarkably accurately to the four sources that Spinoza had described in other words in the Tractatus, became the foundation for the training of any theologian or historian of the Old Testament to the present day. Good-humored about this correspondence, Wellhausen himself acknowledged in a private letter that Spinoza had gotten there first, 200 years earlier, with incomparably more modest instruments, and without the shelter of a Prussian university. But there was one aspect of the Spinozist project that the 19th century did not fully recover, and that the 20th century only began to systematically recover with the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran in 1947. It was the question of the excluded texts. The Qumran caves delivered to the academic world something that Spinoza had only intuited through indirect references, an intact library of Jewish texts from the Second Temple period that had been left out of the official canon and that, accidentally preserved in the arid conditions of the Judean desert, showed the 20th century world a radically more complex, more plural, and more politically contested image of biblical Judaism than any official canon had suggested. The Dead Sea Scrolls contained texts that showed Jewish groups with practices, theologies, and authorities completely different from those that Rabbinic Judaism had preserved in its canon. Texts that presented alternative versions of biblical narratives, texts that indicated that the canon established by the rabbis of Yavne was not the only option available. There were texts that other communities considered sacred with equal conviction. This was not exactly a surprise for anyone who had read Spinoza attentively. It was, in fact, the archaeological empirical confirmation of what he had argued philosophically 3 centuries earlier. And there was more. The 20th century also saw the discovery, in 1945, of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, a collection of Gnostic Christian texts that had been buried in the 4th century, probably by monks trying to protect them from the destruction that ecclesiastical authorities had ordered during the process of consolidating Christian orthodoxy. These texts, the apocryphal Gospels of Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, among others, showed the modern world a version of early Christianity that had been systematically excluded by the canonical process, a version that was more plural, more theologically diverse, and in specific ways that made it immediately understandable why the authorities controlling the canonical process had decided to exclude it. It was, again, the archaeological confirmation of something that Spinoza had argued with the philosophical instruments of his time. The canon was not a revelation, it was a choice made by people with power and interests at a specific historical moment that had crystallized into the sacred over the subsequent centuries simply because no one with enough authority to question the choice had, for long enough, also had the courage to do so. Spinoza died in 1677 without knowing that his discoveries would be confirmed by scrolls buried in the desert for 2,000 years. Without knowing that the academic discipline he had founded would become part of the standard curriculum of any serious theological seminary in the world. Without knowing that the arguments for which he had been excommunicated and that had cost him everything. What he called home would, 3 centuries later, be considered so obvious by any biblical scholar that it would require historical effort to remember that someone once needed courage to say them. What he knew, that February of 1677, as the disease advanced with its relentless patience, was that he had done what he had to do. He had opened the door, there was no way to close it again. The story you have heard so far has not reached its end. We are halfway there. What comes next? Blocks 9 to 14 delves into the dimensions that have only been mentioned until now, the detailed history of the texts excluded from the Old Testament and the New Testament, the councils that made the definitive decisions, and what was happening behind the scenes of those councils, the fate of Spinoza's manuscripts in the century following his death, and the reverberation of his thought to the present, including the debates that are happening today in universities, seminaries, and churches about what to do with what historical criticism has revealed about the origin of the sacred text. There is a date that rarely appears in Sunday sermons, although it is in a way the most important date in the entire history of Western Christianity, 325 D. Nicaea. Emperor Constantine had summoned bishops from across the Roman Empire to a city in present-day Turkey with a goal that he made clear in the letters of convocation, to unify the Church. Not for abstract spiritual reasons, for concrete political reasons. An empire with a single religion was a more governable empire. A divided church was a weakness that Rome's enemies could exploit. The Council of Nicaea is primarily remembered for the Christological issue, the debate over the nature of Christ that resulted in the Nicene Creed. But there was a second agenda, rarely discussed with the same visibility, that Spinoza had identified in the documents that reached him, the question of the texts. Which texts were sacred, which were not? The Church of the 4th century was a fragmented entity, in terms of sacred texts in a way that modern believers can hardly imagine. Different communities in different parts of the empire used different collections of texts. There were communities in Syria that used a harmonized gospel called the Diatessaron. There were communities in Egypt that venerated texts that the Church of Rome considered heretical. There were bishops who included in their liturgical readings texts that other bishops deemed unacceptable. The process that would culminate in the canon of the New Testament as we know it today was not a single decision made at Nicaea. It was a process of decades, in fact, centuries, that involved multiple councils, multiple disputes, and multiple political forces. But Nicaea was the moment when imperial power entered directly into this dispute. And when imperial power enters a theological dispute, theological questions tend to be resolved according to the interests of power. Spinoza had studied the process of the formation of the Christian canon with an attention that, for scholars of the 17th century, was uncommon. Most Christian philosophers examining the origin of the Bible stopped at the limits that their own institutional position made prudent to respect. Spinoza had no such limits. He had been removed from any institutional position at the age of 23 with words intended to ensure that he would never hold one again. What he identified in the historical documents available about the 4th century councils was a pattern that mirrored with a disturbing consistency the pattern he had identified in the formation of the Hebrew canon. The texts that entered the New Testament were consistently the texts that legitimized the hierarchical structure that the Episcopal Church had developed in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The texts that were left out were, equally consistently, the texts that presented the Christian teaching in ways that resisted or subverted that hierarchy. The Gospel of John, with its elevated theology of the Logos, perfectly compatible with the Christology that Nicaea was trying to codify, was included. The Gospel of Thomas, with its sayings of Jesus that emphasized individual self-knowledge over any ecclesiastical mediation, was excluded. The pastoral letters attributed to Paul, with their instructions on ecclesiastical hierarchy, on the submission of women, on obedience to authorities, were included. The texts attributed to Mary Magdalene, with their vision of a more egalitarian Christian teaching, were excluded. There was, in the documents that Spinoza consulted, a particularly revealing passage attributed to Bishop Paphnutius of Alexandria, one of the participants in the Council of Nicaea, that described the process of text selection in terms that no later theologian would repeat with pleasure. Paphnutius described the main criterion for inclusion not as antiquity, not as authenticity, not as documented connection to the apostles, but as utility for the order of the Church. Utility for the order of the Church. Spinoza had underlined this phrase twice, according to the manuscripts that have reached us. It was the confirmation, in the language of the participants in the process themselves, of what he had demonstrated from external textual analysis. The canon was not a revelation, it was a policy. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD was the moment when the list of the 27 books of the New Testament was finally codified in a way that became widely accepted in the West. It was also the moment when something equally important happened. The decision that the texts excluded from the canon should not only be ignored, but actively destroyed. The letter from Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, written in 367 AD, 30 years before Carthage, but functioning as a precursor to the decisions that would be made there, is one of the most revealing documents that survived from the period of the formation of the Christian canon. Athanasius listed the 27 books he considered canonical and explicitly instructed the faithful not to read the others, not to preserve them, and not to transmit them. The consequence of this instruction, implemented with the efficiency that imperial power offered to the Church in the post-Constantinian period, was the destruction of a quantity of primitive Christian text that we will never be able to fully measure. What survived did so by accident, through the Nag Hammadi manuscripts buried in the sands of Egypt by monks who knew what was happening and wanted to save what they could, through copies that reached regions where the reach of episcopal authority was weaker, through fragments that appeared in citations from authors who attacked them, because to attack an idea, it is necessary, at least partially, to reproduce it. Spinoza did not have access to the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. They would be discovered 268 years after his death. But he had access to enough references to reconstruct, in broad terms, what had been lost. And the picture that emerged from these references was sufficiently clear for what he needed to demonstrate. The Christian canon had been built on the deliberate exclusion of voices that presented the teaching of Jesus in ways incompatible with the power structure that the Church had developed in the 3rd and 4th centuries. This did not make the canon false in the sense that the texts that compose it were forgeries. The canonical Gospels were ancient texts, connected to apostolic traditions by lines that could be traced, albeit with much less certainty than tradition claimed. What made the canon a political construction was something else, the fact that there were other texts equally ancient, equally connected to genuine apostolic traditions, equally venerated by primitive Christian communities, and that had been left out not for reasons of authenticity, but for reasons of incompatibility with the institutional power that was being consolidated. The sacred once again had an address, it had a position, it had interests, and the demonstration of this in the 17th century still cost everything a human being could lose. There is a quality in Spinoza's thought that is difficult to describe without sounding like excessive praise, but that his most serious biographers consistently confirm. He was a man absolutely devoid of resentment. This is surprising given what happened to him. Excommunicated at 23, with the harshest words that his tradition had preserved for extreme cases, cut off from family, childhood friends, the community that had been the only world he knew until then, forced to rethink his entire material existence, livelihood, housing, social relationships, from scratch. And then, during the 21 years he lived after excommunication, constantly watched, constantly attacked, constantly subjected to campaigns of defamation that tried to make his name synonymous with everything that was morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. Any one of these elements, alone, would be enough to produce in any reasonable person a considerable amount of bitterness. Spinoza was not bitter, not out of naivety. He clearly understood what had been done to him and why. But because he had arrived, through the same reason he applied to everything else, at an understanding of power and institution that made personal resentment an inadequate response. Institutions do not pursue malice. They pursue out of structural necessity. An institution whose authority is based on a narrative that cannot withstand rational examination will necessarily try to destroy anyone who applies rational examination. It is no different from a cornered animal. The reaction is proportional to the perceived threat, not to the malice of the animal. Understanding this did not eliminate the pain, but it made the pain intelligible. And for Spinoza, making something intelligible was the only form of freedom that a human being could genuinely have. In his last years in The Hague, Spinoza lived with a modesty that his visitors described with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The room was small, the furniture was functional, the library was substantial but unostentatious. He ate little, slept just enough, and worked with the regularity of someone who had organized life in such a way as to eliminate everything that did not serve the only project that mattered. It was not asceticism in the religious sense. There was nothing in Spinoza of the mortification or renunciation that the religious tradition celebrated as virtue. It was simply the practical organization of a life completely oriented towards thought. Every material choice was made based on how much mental space it freed or occupied. And there was, in that life, a quality of peace that his visitors noticed, and that, in the context of the time, was itself a form of provocation. A man who should have been destroyed by excommunication, by relative poverty, by the unanimous condemnation of religious authorities throughout Europe, this man was visibly at peace. It was the lived demonstration of his philosophy. The idea that freedom did not depend on external circumstances, that power over the inner life was the only power that no institution could confiscate. But there was also, in those final years, a darker dimension. The project that had begun as philosophical inquiry had revealed itself over the years to be something heavier than philosophy could carry alone. Spinoza had demonstrated, with a rigor that made the demonstration difficult to refute on its own ground, that the sacred text was a human construction, that the canon had been the product of political choices, that religious authority rested on foundations that could not withstand the honest examination of historical reason. But there was a consequence of this demonstration that he had not fully anticipated when he began. It did not solve the human problem of the need for meaning. The philosophical critique of an institution, no matter how precise, does not fill the void that this institution leaves when its foundation is removed. The people who lived organized around the narrative of divine revelation, who found in that narrative not only political authority, but personal meaning, moral guidance, comfort in the face of suffering and death. These people did not necessarily become freer upon learning that the foundation was constructed. They could become more lost. Spinoza had thought about this. He had articulated in his correspondence and in the Ethics a philosophy of human freedom that did not depend on any supernatural revelation and that he considered more solid, more honest, and more humanly adequate than any religion he had known. But he also knew that this philosophy required a type of intellectual and emotional robustness that was not universal, that there were human beings for whom the religious narrative, even if constructed, even if politically motivated, even if historically questionable, fulfilled a function that cold philosophy could not replace in the same way. This did not make him retreat from his conclusions, but it made him more careful about how and to whom he presented them. The Tractatus had been written in Latin, aimed at an educated audience, precisely because Spinoza did not have the naivety to believe that dismantling the religious foundation of a society without offering anything in return was a service to humanity. The project was longer than his life. In the correspondence of his last years, there are letters that reveal something about Spinoza's internal state that the published philosophical texts do not show with the same clarity. There was a letter to his friend Oldenburg in 1675, in which Spinoza described his hesitation to publish the Ethics in terms that reveal not insecurity about the argument. There was never insecurity about the argument, but awareness of the consequences that ideas produce in the world when they leave the control of the thinker who generated them. I come to the conclusion, he wrote, that I am dealing with something that goes beyond the capacity of reception of the present time. It was a remarkable phrase for a man who had dedicated his life to public thought, to the transmission of his ideas beyond the private circle. It was the recognition that there was a distance between what is true and what is bearable, and that managing this distance was, in itself, a philosophical responsibility. But he published the Ethics anyway. Not in his lifetime, he left it to friends after his death, but he published, because the alternative was silence, and silence for Spinoza was the only betrayal he could not commit. What happened to Spinoza's thought in the centuries immediately after his death is a story of suppression and clandestine influence that ironically confirms the central thesis of what he had argued about power and text. The same mechanism that had operated in the formation of the biblical canon, the selection of what is preserved and transmitted based on the interests of those who control the transmission, operated on Spinoza's legacy. The works he published in life were banned, indicated, attacked. His name became synonymous for decades with atheism and immorality in public philosophical conversations. Spinozism was an insult, not a respectable philosophical category. And while this was happening on the surface, in public discussions and printed controversies, something different was happening in the deeper layers of European intellectual life. His ideas circulated, clandestinely, in philosophical manuscripts that passed from hand to hand among thinkers of the 18th century. Anonymously, in Enlightenment critiques of religious authority that used his arguments without citing the source, transformed in the works of German philosophers at the end of the 18th century who built on his foundations buildings that bore other names but often rested on the same beams. The 19th century brought rehabilitation. Not complete. There is still today, in certain religious and political contexts, fervent resistance to Spinozian thought, but enough for academic philosophy to finally discuss his ideas without the social cost that had made this discussion dangerous for more than a century. Hegel called Spinoza the starting point of all modern philosophy, a remarkable recognition, although conditioned by the need to overcome what he acknowledged. Goethe had said of himself that he considered himself a Spinozist, one of the first European public intellectuals to use the word as a positive identification. And Schleiermacher, the Protestant theologian who tried to reconcile faith with modernity, had described Spinoza as the holiest and deepest soul that had ever lived, a formulation that would have been incomprehensible to Spinoza's contemporaries who had called him forged in hell. The world had changed. Not in the way Spinoza had predicted. It never is in the way the thinker predicts. But it had changed, and in the changes there was the fingerprint of a man who had polished lenses to pay the rent and used the remaining hours to demolish, with the patience and precision of someone who knows they are building something beyond their own lifetime, the foundations of a power that he had considered untouchable for far too long. In the autumn of 1946, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib threw a stone into a cave on the shores of the Dead Sea while searching for a lost goat. He heard the sound of breaking pottery. He entered the cave and found clay jars that had remained sealed for 2,000 years, containing leather scrolls written in a language he could not read. What Mohammed Ed-Dib had found in those Qumran caves, and what would be found in the neighboring caves over the following decades, was an intact library of Jewish texts from the period approximately from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD, a library that had been hastily hidden, probably by members of an ascetic community fleeing Roman war, and that had remained in the desert, preserved by the arid climate, while the rest of the world changed around it. When scholars deciphered these texts over the decades of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a process that was itself marked by disputes, secrets, and accusations of suppression that would have left Spinoza with a smile of recognition, what they found confirmed, with direct archaeological evidence, the central thesis that Spinoza had developed from textual analysis 3 centuries earlier. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed a radically more diverse and politically contested Judaism than the rabbinic canon had suggested. The community of Qumran, probably the Essenes, although this point continues to be debated by experts, had preserved texts that Rabbinic Judaism, in establishing its canon, had excluded. Texts that presented a different view of the history of Israel. Texts that contained community rules that conflicted with those of the temple priesthood. Texts that described a messianic expectation that had little to do with how messianism would be codified in later traditions. Among the manuscripts were versions of biblical books that differed significantly from the texts that had been standardized by the Masoretic transmission process, the process by which medieval Jewish scribes had established the official text of the Hebrew Bible. These differences were not trivial. In some cases, they affected the meaning of theologically important passages. What this meant was precisely what Spinoza had argued. The text we call the Bible had not come down to us in immutable form, transmitted with perfect fidelity since its original composition. It had gone through processes of revision, standardization, and selection among variants, processes conducted by human hands with criteria that were not always purely textual. The second wave of archaeological confirmation came in 1945, 2 years before Qumran, in an even more distant locality, Nag Hammadi in Egypt. An Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging fertilizer near cliffs when he found a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 codices, books, not scrolls, in a format that indicated a more recent date, containing 52 texts in Coptic that were translations of much older Greek originals. They were the Gnostic texts that the Church had tried to eliminate in the 4th century. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. Texts that presented a Jesus and a Christian teaching that Nicene Orthodoxy had declared heretical, and whose destruction it had ordered with the efficiency that imperial power made available to ecclesiastical authority. These texts had survived because someone, probably monks from the nearby monastery of St. Pachomius, had buried them before destruction arrived, preserving for an unknown future what their powerful contemporaries had decided the world should not have. The Gospel of Thomas, in particular, is a text that anyone familiar with Spinoza's analysis of the canonical process immediately recognizes for what it is. A text that presents Jesus' teaching in a way that is perfectly incompatible with the institutional structure that the Church was building. There is no narrative of miracles. There is no narrative of death and resurrection. There is no institution of sacraments. There is no foundation of an ecclesiastical hierarchy. There are only a series of sayings attributed to Jesus, many of them with parallels in the canonical Gospels, others completely different, centered on the idea that the kingdom of God is accessible through self-knowledge, without priestly mediation, without institutional structure, without the need for a church as an indispensable intermediary between the individual and the divine. If you reveal what is within you, what you reveal will save you. If you do not reveal what is within you, what you do not reveal will destroy you. This saying from the Gospel of Thomas did not enter the New Testament, not because it was inauthentic. Researchers like Elaine Pagels have demonstrated that it can be as old as the canonical Gospels, but because a teaching that places salvation in individual self-knowledge, without the need for church, sacraments, bishops, or popes, was structurally incompatible with the institutional project that the canonical process was serving. Spinoza had said this in 1670. Nag Hammadi confirmed it in 1945. The reception of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts by biblical academia and religious institutions was, in itself, a case study in how power manages disturbing knowledge. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1946 and 1947. The complete publication of all the manuscripts only happened in 1991, 45 years later. During that interval, access to the manuscripts was controlled by a small, non-transparent international committee dominated by scholars with religious institutional affiliations who had practical reasons to control the pace of disclosure. When a scholar named John Strugnell, who chaired the committee in the 1980s, was pressed on why the manuscripts had not been fully published after decades, his response was that publication needed to be done carefully enough so that the correct interpretations accompanied the texts. The correct interpretations. The phrase would be comical if it were not exactly the same logic that had governed the original canonical process. It took a kind of academic piracy, the unauthorized publication of photographs of the manuscripts that had been taken decades earlier, to force full disclosure. In 1991, the Biblical Archaeology Society published what the committee had kept secret, and control over the texts was irrevocably lost. Spinoza would have recognized the pattern entirely. What the confluence of Qumran, Nag Hammadi, and 3 centuries of biblical historical criticism produced was, in the academic world of the late 20th century, a consensus that would have been unthinkable for any contemporary of Spinoza, that the Pentateuch is a compilation of multiple sources, that the canonical Gospels are historical documents from the late 1st century, not eyewitness accounts, that the canonical process was political as much as spiritual, that there were alternative forms of Judaism and early Christianity that were excluded not for being less authentic, but for being less compatible with the power structures that won the disputes of the period. This consensus exists. It is in the books. It is taught in universities, including the theological universities of many serious religious traditions. And most people who sit in the pews of Sunday churches and synagogues have never heard of it, not because it is a secret, because no one found it necessary to say. And silence, as Spinoza knew better than anyone of his time, is the most efficient form of control that an institution can exert. There is a document that exists in multiple copies in European archives, which any accredited researcher can consult, that has been discussed in dozens of academic articles, and that the overwhelming majority of Christian faithful have never seen mentioned in any religious context. It is the letter of Eusebius of Caesarea, the 4th century church historian, who was the main ecclesiastical advisor to Emperor Constantine. In this letter, written around 325 AD, during the same period as the Council of Nicaea, Eusebius described his view on how Christian texts should be classified. He created 3 categories. The first were the texts accepted by all, the texts that the Universal Church recognized as authentic and authoritative. The second were the contested texts, texts venerated by some communities but not by all, about whose status there was debate. The third category is the one Spinoza had studied with special attention, because it contained the most direct evidence of the mechanism of exclusion he had tried to reconstruct through indirect analysis. Eusebius called this third category spurious texts, not false in the sense of being deliberate forgeries, but spurious in the sense of not being useful for the order of the Church and therefore disposable. The criterion was explicit. Institutional utility was the main criterion. What was in Eusebius's third category is a list that includes texts we now know through the Nag Hammadi manuscripts and other fragmentary sources, texts that early Christian communities considered sacred, with the same conviction that communities from other regions considered the canonical Gospels. But there was something more in Eusebius's letter that most discussions about it do not mention with the prominence it deserves. Eusebius also described the process by which the texts of the first 2 categories had been identified. And this process was not the careful historical investigation that later tradition would try to suggest. The rigorous verification of the line of transmission from the apostles, consultation with the oldest communities, research in the most complete archives. It was substantially a process of political consultation. The bishops of the most important ecclesiastical sees, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, were consulted about which texts their communities used. And the texts that found agreement among the main sees were accepted. Those that generated disagreement were relegated to the lower categories. The authority of a sacred text, therefore, derived from the authority of the episcopal sees that endorsed it, and the authority of the episcopal sees derived, in part, from their ability to control which texts were considered sacred. It was a perfect circularity. Spinoza had identified similar circularities in the process of forming the Hebrew canon. To see the same mechanism operating, with equal clarity and with even more direct documentation, in the formation of the Christian canon was confirmation that he was describing not a specific historical peculiarity, but a general mechanism, the mechanism by which any institution of power constructs and maintains the narrative that, justifies its authority. In addition to Eusebius's letter, there was another set of documents that Spinoza had studied with increasing attention in the years following the Tractatus. These were the minutes of the local councils that preceded the great universal councils. The Council of Laodicea in 364 AD, the Council of Hippo in 393 AD, the Council of Carthage in 397 AD. These documents survived in a fragmented manner, and the complete minutes of many of them had been lost or, as Spinoza suspected in at least some cases, deliberately destroyed. But the fragments that survived contained details that the official narrative of the canonical process preferred not to emphasize. There were, for example, records of debates about the Apocalypse, the last book of the New Testament, which showed a level of controversy over its inclusion that later tradition presented as if it had never existed. Multiple important bishops of the 4th and 5th centuries had rejected the Apocalypse as non-canonical. Cyril of Jerusalem did not include it in his lists. Gregory of Nazianzus excluded it. John Chrysostom, one of the most influential theologians in the history of the Church, never commented on it and apparently did not consider it part of the New Testament. The Apocalypse entered the Western canon not by consensus, but by the insistence of Augustine of Hippo, whose prestige was, by the end of the 4th century, sufficient to sway decisions that might otherwise have gone in a different direction. A single man with sufficient institutional authority had determined that a book would be sacred to billions of people for the following centuries. This was the mechanism that Spinoza had described, not as a theory, as documented history. There were also the infancy Gospels, a category of texts that described the life of Jesus between his birth and the beginning of his public ministry, a period about which the canonical Gospels are almost completely silent. These texts circulated widely in the Christian communities of the early centuries. The Proto-Evangelium of James, which narrates the story of the conception and birth of Mary, and which is the source of many of the Marian traditions that Catholicism preserves to this day, was read as sacred text in communities from Egypt to Syria. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy, and other similar texts were part of the early Christian narrative universe in a way that the final canon erased. Why were they not included? The most honest answer, the answer that emerges when one examines the conciliar debates without the disposition to find only what tradition wants to find, is that these texts presented an image of the child Jesus that did not align with the Christology that Nicaea had codified. The boy Jesus of the infancy Gospels is often described as mischievous, sometimes dangerous, capable of causing the death of other boys with his uncontrolled child magic, an image incompatible with the perfect divinity that the Nicene Creed had established as doctrine. Again, the exclusion served a theological political project, and the theological political project served an institutional power structure. The mechanism was always the same. What Spinoza extracted from all this analysis, from the Pentateuch, from Jewish councils, from Christian councils, from the excluded texts of both canons, was a conclusion that went beyond specific religious criticism. It was a conclusion about how human beings use the idea of the sacred. The sacred is one of the most powerful forces that human psychology knows. The ability of certain narratives, certain rituals, certain texts to organize human life around a center of meaning is real, regardless of the question of their supernatural or human origin. Whatever one thinks about whether God exists or not, it is empirically undeniable that religion has fulfilled and continues to fulfill psychological, social, and political functions that are deeply rooted in human nature. And it is precisely for this reason that the sacred is so useful to power, because what is sacred does not need to justify itself. It does not need to answer questions. It can demand obedience without offering reasons, can demand silence without offering explanations, can demand submission without offering counterbalances that pass through the sieve of reason. The mechanism that Spinoza had identified in the canonical process, the transformation of human political choices into uncontestable divine obligations, was not a peculiarity of religious history. It was an exemplary case of a much more general mechanism, the mechanism by which power becomes invisible by becoming sacred, and the antidote that Spinoza proposed, Not the destruction of the sacred, but its historical understanding, the revelation of the human choices behind the apparent divine needs, was, in the 17th century and continues to be today, the most direct way to confront this mechanism. Not with violence, not with iconoclasm, with questions, with method, with the willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable places. In 2015, Leiden University, the same city where Spinoza had lived for a few years after his excommunication, organized an international symposium on the legacy of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish theologians, philosophers, historians, and biblical studies experts participated. The symposium lasted 3 days and was, according to the participants' accounts, marked by a level of agreement that would have been unthinkable in any similar debate held in previous centuries. The agreement was not about Spinoza's religious conclusions. There were on these profound and legitimate divergences. The agreement was about the validity of the method, about the fact that the historical critical analysis of the Bible, the analysis that Spinoza had founded, was not only academically respectable, but necessary for any serious understanding of sacred texts. The irony of the symposium being held in Leiden did not escape any of the participants. What happened between 1677 and 2015, between Spinoza's death and the Leiden Symposium, is a story of slow and resisted assimilation. The historical criticism of the Bible, founded by Spinoza and developed by German scholars in the 19th century, entered European universities throughout the 19th century with the kind of institutional resistance that was to be expected. Professors were dismissed, books were burned, scholars were excommunicated, this time by Christian authorities, not Jewish ones, but with the same mechanism of institutional silencing that had operated on Spinoza himself. But the method survived, and in the 20th and 21st centuries, it became the foundation of academic training in theology at major universities around the world, including the confessional universities of the religious traditions that had the most to lose from it. Why did religious institutions eventually accept the method they had tried to destroy? The answer is not simple, but it has a central thread. There was, in the more intellectually serious religious traditions, a gradual understanding that trying to suppress historical criticism was a battle that could not be won, because the method was academically valid and its results were reproducible by anyone who applied it with sufficient rigor. Continuing to fight it was wearing down the intellectual credibility of the institutions without any real gain. The alternative was what the most sophisticated theologians of the 20th century developed, separating the historical question from the spiritual question. Recognizing that the Bible was a historically conditioned text produced by human beings in specific contexts, without eliminating the possibility that this human text could also be the vehicle of something that transcended its historical origin. It was an intellectually respectable solution. It was not the solution that Spinoza had proposed. His was more radical, more willing to accept the full consequences of the method. But it was a form of institutional survival that allowed religious traditions to continue to exist in a world where the historical critical method had made textual naivety impossible for anyone with sufficient education. But there was, and is, a problem with this solution that the theological debate of the 21st century has not yet completely resolved. The problem is this: if we recognize that the Bible is a historically conditioned text produced by specific groups in specific contexts for specific purposes, then what is the basis for continuing to use this text as the foundation of universal moral authority? If Leviticus was written by the priestly source to legitimize the power of the Levitical priesthood in the post-exilic period, what is the basis for using its prohibitions as eternal moral law? If the pastoral letters of the New Testament, which scholars today agree were probably not written by the historical Paul, were composed decades after Paul's death to legitimize a specific ecclesiastical structure, what is the basis for using its instructions on hierarchy and submission as apostolic revelation? This question, which Spinoza had posed in the Tractatus and which the following centuries did not fully answer, remains, in the 21st century, the most difficult question that any religious tradition faces, not because there are no possible answers. There are several, some more convincing, others less so, but because the honestly available answers differ from the responses that institutions had offered before Spinoza. And changing the responses changes the structures of authority that depend on those responses, and the structures of authority, as Spinoza had demonstrated, rarely change without resistance. In the contemporary world, the debate about the origin of the Bible is no longer just a debate among academic specialists. The Internet has made accessible to anyone with a connection and curiosity the results of 3 centuries of biblical historical criticism. Documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels, open-access academic articles. All of this has made the kind of knowledge that Spinoza needed decades to accumulate available in simplified, but not necessarily dishonest versions, to anyone who decides to seek it out. And many people are searching. Studies of secularization in Western countries consistently show that one of the most frequently cited reasons for abandoning traditional religious practices is the knowledge, partial, sometimes poorly digested but real, of the contradictions, anachronisms, and historical processes behind sacred texts. People who discover, often in non-religious contexts, that Moses probably did not write the Pentateuch, or that the canon of the New Testament was established by political councils, often experience this as a betrayal, the feeling that they have been kept in ignorance about something that is, ultimately, the foundation of the belief system that organized their lives. This reaction is exactly what Spinoza had predicted, and the prediction was not satisfied with pleasure. It was recorded as a problem that the transition from religious narrative to historical understanding needed to manage carefully if it did not want to simply destroy without building. Spinoza's contribution to the contemporary world is not that of a satisfied demolisher. It is that of an architect who had realized that the existing building had foundations that would not withstand the weight of time, and who had begun, on the margins of his time and with the tools he had, to sketch a different design. A design in which the dignity of the human being did not depend on any supernatural revelation, in which morality was grounded in reason and human nature, not in the authority of texts written by hands that did not always have the interests of humanity in general, in which political freedom, the freedom to think, to express, to question, was not a privilege, but the necessary condition for any human life that deserved that name. This project is still not complete. Perhaps it never will be. Perhaps incompleteness is part of its nature, the characteristic of any project that takes seriously the idea that thought has no definitive endpoint. But it is underway. And the man who started the process, the Jewish boy from Amsterdam who read the wrong book with the lamp lit while the rain fell on the roofs of Vlooienburg, had in his strange and solitary life more to do with the world we live in than most of the names we learned in school. We have reached the end of a story that has no end. This is its most honest characteristic. The stories that truly end, with a clean resolution, with all the knots untied, with the feeling that now we know enough to close the book and move on, are the stories that gently deceive us. They are the stories that allow us not to think anymore. The story of Spinoza and the Bible is not one of those. It is a story that ends leaving the most important questions open, not for lack of answers, but for excess of consequence. The questions that Spinoza opened are of the kind that, once asked with sufficient seriousness, permanently change the relationship of those who ask them with the text, with the institution, with authority, with the sacred. And this change is not simple. It is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thing that is resolved in a single video, or in a single conversation, or in a single book. It is a process. The same process that Spinoza lived from the age of 10, when he first felt that there was something in the text that did not fit, until he was 44 years old when he died on a February Sunday while his friends were at Mass. What Spinoza demonstrated, and what 3 centuries of archaeological and historical confirmation have solidified, can be reduced to a set of statements that are today accepted by any serious scholar of the Bible, regardless of their personal religious position. The Pentateuch was not written by Moses. It was compiled from multiple sources over centuries by groups with distinct interests, in a process that had its most significant editorial moment during and after the Babylonian exile. The Gospels of the New Testament were not written by eyewitnesses. They are documents from the late 1st century, composed decades after the events they describe, by communities with specific theological and political concerns of their time. The biblical canon, both Hebrew and Christian, was established by historical processes that were explicitly political at crucial points. Texts were included and excluded based on criteria that included, in documented form, institutional utility. There were excluded texts that were equally ancient, equally connected to the traditions that produced them, equally venerated by communities that used them, and that were left out not for being less authentic, but for being less compatible with the power structures that won the theological disputes of the period. But here is the point at which Spinoza's demonstration goes beyond historical criticism, and it is the point that his detractors often omit when describing him as simply a destroyer of religion. Spinoza did not conclude from this demonstration that religion was worthless. He did not conclude that sacred texts were simply frauds. He did not conclude that human spiritual experience was an illusion that reason should dissipate. He concluded something different and much more interesting, that religion, understood as a set of moral narratives and community practices that help human beings live together with some dignity and some sense of purpose, could have real value without needing supernatural foundations that could not withstand honest examination. That the sacred text, understood as an extraordinary human document, the accumulated product of generations of human beings trying to formulate the hardest questions about existence, death, suffering, justice, love, and God, could be profoundly meaningful precisely because it was human, not despite its humanity, but because of it. That the difference between understanding a text as infallible divine revelation and understanding it as a complex human construction was not necessarily the difference between respect and disrespect. It could be the difference between a naive relationship and an adult relationship, more difficult, more demanding, richer. When Spinoza was excommunicated at the age of 23, the community that expelled him used the heaviest words that liturgical Hebrew had reserved for extreme cases. Cursed by day, cursed by night, cursed when lying down, cursed when rising. And then added something that is rarely cited in narratives about the excommunication, that no one should speak to him, that no one should read what he wrote, that no one should approach within 4 cubits of his presence. Total silence, social non-existence, the maximum penalty. Spinoza left that ceremony, crossed the streets of Amsterdam in the July rain, that is the kind of rain that the Netherlands produces without particular ceremony, got home and continued to work. Not because he was insensitive to what had happened. The letters he wrote in the following years show a man who deeply understood the weight of loss, of family, of community, of the only world he had known. But because there was something that was stronger than the weight of loss. It was the conviction, not as an abstract belief but as a concrete experience lived every hour of serious intellectual work, that honest thought was not just a right. It was a responsibility to those who would come after, to those who would have access to the ideas he was building in a small room with a lamp and the determination of a man who had decided, at some point in his adolescence, that there would be no point where thought would stop. 3 centuries later, the ideas that cost Spinoza everything are part of the curriculum of any serious university that teaches the history of the Bible. The arguments for which he was called forged in hell are today reproduced in theology manuals, discussed in religious seminars, incorporated into the training of priests, pastors, and rabbis who use them to understand the texts they preach. This does not mean that Spinoza won. The world is not like that. There are no definitive victories in the realm of ideas, only advances that generate resistances that generate new advances. But it means that the fuse of the bomb he lit in 1670 continued to burn for 3.5 centuries, and what exploded, that continues to explode slowly. In every person who asks for the first time the question he asked was not the sacred. It was the shell of power that had been built around the sacred so that the sacred would serve power. And the sacred, freed from this shell, is a different thing. More vulnerable, more human, more honest about what it is and about what it cannot be. Perhaps in the end, more worthy of the name it carries. This channel exists for the same kind of conversation that Spinoza had in Van den Enden's circle, the conversation of those who are not willing to stop at the point where thought begins to disturb. If this story moved you in some way, if any part made you think of something you hadn't thought of before, or think differently about something you had already thought about, write in the comments. It doesn't have to be a conclusion. It can be a doubt, an objection, a memory that this story brought to the surface. And if you are not yet officially part of this circle, subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this, stories that the official tradition preferred not to tell, that remained buried in archives and manuscripts and archaeological ruins, waiting for the kind of attention that Spinoza taught to give. The next story is already being built, and as Spinoza knew, the best stories are the ones that do not end with answers. They end with questions worth carrying.